Lecture begins. Macro 19. I have to finish theory of capital and production, and then the two of you, all right, and then move on to growth. So I'll try to do both within the 75 minutes as much as I can. So we were last time covered time preference, right? So now we move to capital goods. So 16 is capital goods. And capital goods are associated with intermediate stages of production. So anything which is within an intermediate stage of production is considered a capital good. A different way of saying it is anything that is not going to be consumed directly by the consumer is a capital good. Capital good represents a combination of time, labor, capital, and some other natural resources. The next important piece is that for capital good, essential ingredient is saving. In other words, if something is produced, one of two things happens. It is either consumed or else it becomes a capital good. Well, or else it becomes a saving. So, saving from this point of view becomes the equivalent of capital goods. So there is no other way to increase or generate capital goods but save in the first place what has been already produced. The last piece about capital goods is how they can be changed to other uses. If a capital good is very close to the consumer, then it is extremely difficult to convert to any other use. Yes, it is possible, but much harder. If it is far, far, far away from the consumer, it's very easy to convert it. An example will be you have some special piece of steel with a certain shape. Well, you can't use it for very many things. Maybe for cutting, maybe for some other stuff. On the other hand, you have an iron mine. Out of it you produce iron. Well, within the iron you could produce steel, you could produce anything else. Well, that steel you could put in any shape or form which you could use for other things. So the closer it is to the consumer, the harder it is to convert for any other use. Bread, for example. Once you have a ready-made bread, it's extremely difficult to convert it to a cookie or to anything else. Pretty much either gotta eat it or give it to the dog to eat it. However, if you have flour, out of flour you can easily convert to bread, but you can make cookies, you could make a whole bunch of other things with flour. So the range of potential use for a capital good is much, much wider than it is, for a far away, which is a high order capital good, than a low order capital good. 17 is the concept of saving. Of course, as I mentioned, it is integrally related to capital goods and capital, and therefore production. It is what we call the other side of the same coin. So when you have capital, the one side of the coin is capital good, the other side of the coin is savings. So savings represents a postponement of consumption for possibly later, further, better uses. It is basically, the philosophy is fairly simple. We sacrifice today for the benefit of tomorrow. For example, you guys could have been working and making money. Instead, you have not been working. Instead, you have been investing in yourselves. Again, this requires prior savings. Your parents saved or somebody else saved to feed you through school so that you can actually study. So basically the idea is you sacrifice today for a much higher salary tomorrow or 4 years from today. And the last one is trivial. Saving always results in capital goods. Next we have investments. Well, investment is simply the process of accumulation of capital goods. So, by investing, you add to capital goods. And of course, the same story, it requires prior saving. '19 is time coordination. Now, time coordination refers to the balance between present consumption and future consumption. Between present goods and versus future goods. But here is the key. If you're going to be having a future good and a present good, this means that if it is not a present good, it must necessarily be that you have, instead of future goods, you get today a capital. So it is either a present good or a future good, the whole production. Well, but at the same time it is a present good or a capital good. Well, of course it is logical by the mere definition of a capital good, because capital goods always lead to future goods. So a capital good is a good which we have today, which we do not consume, but instead use to produce future goods. All right? So time coordination is effectively the balance between present goods and capital goods, or present goods and future goods. Well, what was providing the balance or coordination between present goods and future goods from a couple of lectures ago?
Interest rate.
Interest rate. That's the bonus point. Perfect answer. Send me an email. So, one of the key characteristics is that interest rate has the crucial role of coordinating between the present and the future. And therefore, again, the same different way of thinking between balancing today with, balancing consumption today with saving today. So, the interest rate of balancing today with consumption today has the crucial role of coordinating present goods with future goods or with capital goods. So, key to the production structure has interest rate. Let's see what else we have. Time coordination. Oh, but, here is the but. Where is the interest rate determined? Interest rate is directly determined by, if you'd remember from 2 lectures ago, time preference. Let's remind that time preference was the preference of consumers to consume today over tomorrow, or alternatively, to postpone today's consumption for the benefit of tomorrow. So, the key to understanding is that time preference is the driver of interest rate, and interest rate provides the coordination or time coordination between present goods and future goods. So in this sense, time preference, if you'd remember, is inherent in people's preferences. This is not that a politician can change. It is part of who people are, what they are, what their culture is. It may be a culture of savers, like Japanese and Chinese. It may be a culture of consumers, as Western Europeans, and most prominently Americans. So it is part of the overall culture, mentality, internal way of thinking. It is not too much of a policy. It's not too well affected by policy. By politicians or central bank or anybody else. Now, let me throw in here. If people had, based on their own internal time preferences, would determine one interest rate, and the central bank, through the sheer force of monetary policy, determines a different interest rate, whether it's higher or lower, it will necessarily lead to a discoordination of the capital structure. So a monetary policy which does not perfectly match people's time preferences will necessarily distort the capital structure by making it artificially long or artificially short, and will cause, of course, problems down the road. Well, this is called the business cycle. It will cause a business cycle initially to boom, and then it will cause necessarily a crisis down the road. All right, 20, capital structure. Well, let's simply say, what is a capital structure? This is simply the capital, or all capital goods in their sequence as they are used for a specific product. You take bread. Right before bread, you need the capital of a store where the bread is sold. Then, before that, you need the capital structure of an oven where the bread is going to be baked. Well, before that, you need the capital structure of getting the flour into whatever so that you put it in the oven. Well, if you're going to get flour, you need a mill which will take wheat and convert wheat into flour. Well, if you're going to get wheat, you'd better have a combine or a tractor or some other agricultural device. Well, if you're going to be using the tractor and whatnot, you'll need first to sow the seeds, then you need some fertilizer and whatnot. So starting backward or forward, this all represents the capital structure of, for example, bread. Well, any production will have its own capital structure. Simple as that. So one of the key characteristics of a capital structure is that the longer the capital structure, the more productive. It follows out a simplest assumption, which is logically derived, that no matter what the production, no matter what the technology is, for a given capital, entrepreneurs and capitalists will always use the shortest possible production structure. So, if you use today the shortest possible production structure, anytime you put in a longer one, you're going to be getting higher productivity. An example will be with, catching fish with little capital. Well, what is the little capital catching fish? Well, you just bare hands, you grab and you catch it. Of course, you guys understand, well, that's not very, very productive and efficient. Maybe you can catch a couple of fish a day. Well, next step, you get yourself a stick. and you sharpen it up front. Try to use it like a spear, and you use it like Indians have been using it. Try to, you know, spear with that stick or with that spear the fish. Your productivity is definitely going to go up, no question about it. Well, then you can try with a line and then a hook and try, you know, fishing the way, you know, people have done for, let's say, many centuries. Of course, that will be much better than just with the spear. Well, then you move on, you get a net. Well, with the net, of course, requires a lot more capital, requires a lot more preparation. Of course, the net's going to be much more productive. Well, then you put in a net, and let's say one of those, you know, kind of like trawler ship, which, you know, drags the net, and the net, you know, captures fish. Well, if it's moving through the water and catches the fish, it's going to be even more productive. The point is, you can add more and more and more capital. In this particular case, lengthen the production structure. And in the course of doing that, you could be more productive. Well, one of the better ways to be productive by catching fish is just blow it up with dynamite. Of course, dynamite, you know, just throw it in the water, 1 second later, all the fish are belly up, right? You just catch them, you know, good or bad for eating is a different story altogether. The point, it is phenomenally productive and efficient, but how do you produce, guys, dynamite? Now you got to think about the factory, how many chemists, you know, degrees, engineering, you know, chemistry and whatnot. You need factories and all this kind of stuff. Dynamite is simply not easy to produce, all right? So another example will be, hey, maybe a fast way to catch fish is electrocute. You know, you put a couple of million volt on the one end in the, you know, in the area, million volt in the other, blow it up, and, you know, fish is dead. Well, how do you produce 1 million volts of electricity in a shock? Of course, it's going to require massive electric generation, so it's extremely lengthy capital structure and process to get to the point of getting 1 million volts. All right, is this fair, guys? Kind of illustrating the basic concept. All right, let's see what else we have with capital structure. All right, next concept was basically done. Next concept is that of a capitalist. All right, capitalist has 1,001 different definitions, and everybody understands capitalist in many different ways. Today, it is very hot and very modern. Everybody to blame capitalists and, you know, to call it capitalists are evil men who are greedy to exploit workers and whatnot. But in economics, capitalist is simply an economic agent or person that saves and provides savings in the form of capital. So this is a saver who provides his savings in the form of capital. So a shorter way of saying it is that a capitalist is a supplier of capital. '22 is depreciation. Well, depreciation is simply the wear and tear of capital goods as they are used in the process of production or whatever they do. You have a road, of course, if you have thousands of trucks going through the road, of course the road will depreciate and will lose its quality to provide nice smooth service and ride and whatnot. You get a car, you drive it mile after mile, a couple of 100,000 miles, and the car will depreciate to the point of where it's not worth fixing and repairing, better to throw it. So depreciation is one of the most intuitive concepts in economics where people understand remarkably well. What is important to note is that depreciation is always present There is no capital good which does not depreciate. Even land depreciates. You use land over and over again without properly maintaining it, meaning investing back in the land. The land will soon become barren and produce no more. So you got to do a whole bunch of things to maintain the productivity of land at the normal. Well, all those bunch of things to maintain productivity is called investment. And the investment is simply to maintain the value. So, you have a house and there's some problem in the roof. You gotta fix that roof so it doesn't leak and cause further damages in the house. Well, this is a form of investing in the house in order to maintain it. So, depreciation lowers the value of capital. It always lowers it. It is always present. And some investment must be made only to maintain the value of the capital. Of course, you can invest in more than the depreciation and you will increase the productivity of the capital and therefore its value. Now, here's a little trick again with the keyword capital itself. Capital is a little bit confusing. You know, capital, wasn't I talking so far about capital? Well, I was talking more about capital goods and about capital structure. Well, the capital itself is just, let's call it the value of capital goods. So capital is the value or the market value of capital goods. So you got a taxi. The taxi itself is the capital good. For example, the capital structure of the taxi will also require a radio connectivity with others so you can get a call. But the value of your taxi may be just $3,000. Question?
Is there a common classification of types of capital goods?
Yes, there are lots of classifications, but I certainly don't want to get at least now into that. And again, the major classification is that these are considered to be real capital versus financial capital, or real assets versus financial capital, financial assets. So in terms of capital goods in economics, we always, and I mean always, think in terms of real assets. We always think in terms of land, machine, and equipment will be considered some of the major capital goods. One big category will be considered infrastructure. And let me repeat for all of you what is considered to be infrastructure. These are considered roads, electricity lines, water pipelines, today internet connectivity, meaning with all the cables, for cable TV lines, so all of these things, for example, gas lines where you have gas, crude oil pipelines, even for infrastructure we would call in a refinery which converts crude oil into gasoline or diesel. So all of these are considered infrastructure. They themselves do not produce, but they are used in the course of production indirectly. Okay, so capital, the next characteristic of capital is that it is used for economic calculation. In other words, if it represents the value, it will have some money value. $1,000, $5,000, 3,000 euro. Well, once you get money, you use it. Remember, that's one of the three fundamental functions of money. You use it as a unit of account, and it allows you to provide economic calculation. Okay, once you have economic calculation, it provides signals. Oh, this is more valuable, we're going to invest here, and this is less valuable, we're not going to invest there. Let's see. Okay, the other key piece for capital is that if it's going to be market value, it necessarily requires markets. In other words, you cannot get the value of capital unless you have a market where capital values are traded and therefore determined. Therefore, capital markets are extremely important for from an economic point of view, because capital markets provide prices of capital, it provides the value of capital, and therefore allows economic agents to calculate and therefore make decisions of investment based on the value of capital. In other words, if there is no market for capital, you have no way of knowing whether the price is high or low, and therefore you have no way of knowing, is this a really good investment or a really bad investment altogether. So that is very important. In other words, it provides you a price signal. 24 is a repetition of what was already said. Interest rate represents the relative price of present goods to future goods. Sometimes we call this the market price of present goods to, or in relation to future goods. Then we move on to 25, and these are components of interest rates. If you remember, we had originally two components of interest rate. One was the real interest rate, and the other one was the inflation component. So now we still say inflation component, which we sometimes call purchasing power component. So interest rates will always have a component to compensate for the loss of purchasing power. That is for inflation. The second one we call pure interest rate, and pure interest rate is also, or better known today as risk-free. As the risk-free component of interest rates. And the last component, now we're getting one step closer to money, banking, and lending. It is called the risk component. The risk that the investment might not work out, or if you lend it to someone else, the risk that he might not pay you back all in full and on time. The risk that someone will not pay you in full on time is called default risk. So sometimes it is called a risk component, sometimes it is called a default component, and sometimes it is simply called the risk of default component. Okay? I mean, different things. Question?
Can these components add up to each other, or
what is it?
Can these two components add up to each other? I mean, does
which component with which?
Pure interest rate and the risk interest rate.
Okay, they're not interest rate. They are components of interest rate.
I mean, does one necessarily exclude the other, or do they go together?
Oh, they always go together. So any interest rate will have these three components. And, for example, if it is a government bond, which is considered no risk, no default whatsoever, then for a government bond, this particular component will have 0% premium. This component will be 0 for government bonds. And then for different types of bonds or loans, depending on their credit worthiness, which is measured by the credit rating of that particular debt or that particular institution, they will have higher premium. This is also called a premium. So I have a risk premium based on the risk. So the higher the risk, the higher will be the risk component or the risk premium. So this represents a compensation to the investor slash capitalist for providing or risking his capital for a higher default rate. All right? I mean, that's all common sense. More questions here? More questions? None? Let's see what's next. Interest rate. Okay, let's introduce this term here. The sum of these three, when you include both risk and pure inflation, it has a special name. We call it gross interest rate. So gross interest rate. And sometimes it is well known in the literature as nominal interest rate. So whether you say gross interest rate or nominal interest rate will mean that it will include these three components, although very possibly, certainly for government bonds, the risk component will be practically 0. Okay? For all risky investments, meaning risky type of investments, there will be some risky component. All right? Let's see what else we have. Okay, another 126 is a straightforward relationship. It is perfectly logical. We've said it before. Let's outline it again. Lower time preference, meaning if time preference goes down or people decide to lower their time preference, the result will be more abundant savings. In other words, savings will go up, and if savings go up, interest rates must go down. So, if people decide to lower their time preference, they will be willing to consume less today and save more. In the increased supply of savings, which is mathematically equivalent to increased supply of capital, will result in a lower price of capital, meaning lower interest rate. Is this fairly logical? Questions?
What's going to influence people to decide to lower their time preference?
Well, number one, they get scared. For example, the economic environment becomes very uncertain. And if it becomes uncertain, say, well, rather than eagerly consume, we gotta save some more. It has a very special name. It is called precautionary saving. When people feel that the economy might not be right, that they may lose their jobs, that their house, the value of their house falls, or they observe their stocks fall in price, they say, oh, we are running losses on our house and on our stocks, and I may actually lose my job. And then they'll just say, well, we gotta save some more, just in case something goes wrong. What may make them save more, which always happens, is with the advance of age, which is simply guys call, growing old. Older people tend to save a a lot more as they expect to have a lot lower earnings when they retire, or no earning whatsoever. So a 30, 40-year-old person will have a fairly high time preference. They want to consume today, buy a house, buy a car and whatnot, while a 55, 60-year-old person would rather not consume a lot and instead save a lot for later days. So that might be a different type of an example where saving might be higher. Another type of saving which will be effectively used as an investment will be education. Parents got, like, I don't know, I'm just throwing a random number here, 2,000 level income, and they say, oh, we'll need for our daughter 1,000 a month. That will include tuition fee, food, whatever. And they say, okay, we gotta cut down substantially, the two parents, in order to finance, that's how I call it, finance, because it involves effectively capital or conversion to capital. We gotta save a lot in order to pay for education. So parents would sometimes force themselves to save a lot more, meaning they will simply lower their time preference. All right? Is this kind of explaining it? So these are all the reasons. And then there is that last thing which is called cultural shift. Well, in this particular case, the great example will be 100 years ago. Do you know which nation had the highest propensity to save? I mean, can you guys imagine today that America was a country of savers? That America saved the most in the world? It had the highest savings rate, between 40 and 45%. Americans saved more than anybody else. Well, again, it comes out of who were the first original American settlers. You know, these were people with religious values. For them, saving was part of their morals and whatnot. And only recently, let's say in the 50s and 60s, I mean like 50 years ago, Americans became a nation of consumers, and the culture of these moral values and whatnot, that saving is good, has been changed, that it's okay to consume, and if you don't have money, it's okay to borrow to consume, all right? So, again, these are cultural shifts, but it's important to understand that these cultural shifts usually take decades in order to get this transformation of the mentality of a whole nation and culture. More questions? More? None. All right, so intertemporal coordination. I think that's close to Inter 27. Okay, let's see how this works out. Intertemporal coordination is determined by interest rates, and intertemporal coordination is the coordination, let's put it in here, between consumers, savers, investors, producers, and entrepreneurs. All right, so this is the crucial role played by interest rates for all of these parties in the process of production. Well, some of these consume whatever is produced. Others will save. Others will just invest. So, the intertemporal coordination occurs by the interest rate. The interest rate is what provides the coordination between all parties as to how much to consume today, how much to produce and then how much to invest. And the key role is that of interest rate. Now, the next piece is that the intertemporal coordination is necessary in order to determine the capital structure. So, if interest rates are lowered, it will be the result of higher savings and lower time preference. It will provide to everybody the signal that the capital structure may lengthen and become more productive tomorrow. So this whole process of coordinating between all of these parties over time, between present and tomorrow, is called this intertemporal coordination. All right. Oh, here is another key piece which turns out to be very important. It is perfectly logical, but people sometimes don't pay attention. And this is the overall concept of coordination. And the idea is that the coordination is provided by the interest rate, but the key is that it is the same interest rate throughout the capital structure. So the key is that the coordination occurs because, for example, not accounting for risk, the interest rate is always 5. It is 5 between the consumer and the baker when the consumer borrows from the baker. It is 5% from the baker who makes the bread and the seller of flour. It is 5% between the producer of flour and the seller of wheat, and between the seller of wheat, the buyer of wheat and the agricultural farmer. So all across the chain, it is extremely important to understand that the interest rate is always the same. And because the interest rate is the same, it provides uniform capital structure across the board. Everyone is having 5%. Okay? That excludes, of course, the risk default, which will be added on top of, the risk for each particular borrower, which is user of capital. So this is what is provided, the coordination, same interest rate. Okay, let's see what else. The next one is called rate of profit. Next, the coordination within the production structure is provided by the rate of profit. What is the rate of profit? This is the profit that a unit of capital makes for 1 year. So, whatever profit you have, you divide by the capital, the value of capital goods, and this tells you the rate of profit. Rate of profit is sometimes better known as profitability. Okay? So, the rate of profit is the other signal to coordination in general between the intertemporal coordination and the capital structure. It simply means if there is a business or a link within the capital structure that provides higher profitability, then entrepreneurs will increase their investments in that particular link, and by increasing their investments, they will increase the supply of that link and will drive its profitability to a normal rate. In economics, when the production structure is competitive, the rate of profit will equal the interest rate. In other words, the return of capital will equal the cost of capital. Okay? So when profits are 0, the return of capital equals the cost of capital, which is the no profit requirement, and no profit requirement is essentially saying that under or in the competitive economy, competition drives profits down to zero. Well, this is what coordinates competition for each section of the capital structure. All right, let's see what else we have. Inventories is a basic concept which everybody, I'm skipping 3031. Inventories. For example, if you are the baker, you have, is 2931? Yeah, well, 30 is production structure, which I'm skipping. Production structure is 30. So capital structure, 30 becomes production. Structure. Again, this is essentially the stages through which production has to occur or intermediate goods must flow through to become a consumer good in the hands of the consumers. So, inventories are simply stocks of intermediate capital goods. So, this is a stock of intermediate capital goods, which are, let's see how we say it, on hand, which are on hand, held at each stage of production. So, you have a baker, he will have some inventory of flour. Again, he will not run his business without full or decent inventory of flour, maybe for a couple of days or possibly for a couple of weeks. Then, if there is a mill that converts wheat into flour, the mill will certainly maintain significant quantities of wheat so that it doesn't run out and can, keep its production going. On the other hand, it will also keep certain amount of flour, which is the final product, so that if there is excess demand, then, it will be able to supply it. And the final point, which just is not a theoretical point, it is just in practice, 32, is that at any point in time or for any period, value of capital is just an observation of real life. Value of capital goods vastly exceeds, meaning is many, many times higher, significantly higher than the value of consumer goods. It just turns out because the production structure is so long, you get, let's say, 10,000 breads today out of the bakery. But across the production structure, the wheat in the meantime, the flour in the meantime, the electricity and all the other stuff, the value of all the capital goods in the meantime is many times higher than the production of consumer goods. So, from this point of view, to understand in general is that by managing the value in the production of consumer goods, you cannot possibly manage well the economy. Because this is tiny relative to the overall economy. In other words, if you have the economy as a funnel working like this, this is the stage here of consumer goods. And here you have stage 1, which pushes through stage 2, which pushes through stage 3, it pushes through 4, 5, ... until it gets to this point. The value of consumer goods will be these goods here. Of course, this is for a particular day or a particular year. But in the meantime, you have more value in the previous stage, probably a lot more even here. So when you add up the value of these in the whole production structure, you will be getting many more times, maybe 10, maybe 50 times more than the consumer goods. If you're really going to be trying somehow, one way or the other, to manage the economy, you should be focusing on those capital goods as opposed to focusing on consumer goods. Moreover, what is important to understand, it is a result, just a basic statistical result, and this is 20 or 50 times bigger than this one, is if you simply try to boost some more consumption, you know, just write a check for every person for $5,000 as Bush is doing right now, maybe 2,000 depending on the family, how many, you know, taxes, children, whatnot. And you try to really boost consumption overall here, it doesn't mean that you're going to boost a lot or at all the economy, because boosting this piece here is kind of like a drop in the bucket. You understand that? I mean, it's not going to change much if this is 50 times bigger and the incentives aren't good enough in this piece, or in the meantime, there are economic processes that offset this here. Okay? So, if the economic circumstances lower the production across the board, but you just boost over here, all you do is essentially you lower your inventories across the board. So the store will not have 200 computers on hand, we'll have 150. But it doesn't mean that computer makers will produce more computers just because you send a check and people bought, let's say, 1 million computers, okay? Questions?
I'm sorry, but I didn't quite get it. Shouldn't it be like if we increase the consumer goods, shouldn't the capital goods increase proportionally?
No,
I mean, because it would create incentives for the producers to create more consumer goods.
Okay. Here is the key. This is a very, very good question. How about half a bonus point, right? YOLO's level. Well, you need it because from last time you lost one, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, here is the key. If you're going to be producing this, these are all called, by definition, remember, capital goods. Capital goods, okay? Well, what is the one and only source of capital goods?
Savings.
Yeah, meaning first of all, investment, and the investment comes out of only one place, savings. So, you can boost this one here, you can increase the productivity, but here's the trick. In Bulgaria today, I mean, I'll get back, let's say, in the US, like 2 or 3, 4 years ago, we cannot produce bricks. I mean, you understand, and everybody understands that real estate in Bulgaria is phenomenally profitable. We have this wild real estate boom. It's a phenomenal bubble. It is extremely profitable. It costs like 150 euro to produce a square foot of a house, and they sell it for 5, 6, 7, 800. It's like, you know, they sell it for 3, 4 times higher. But does it mean they're going to produce a lot more? The answer is, if they had the bricks, yes, they would. Oh, turns out we can't even produce our own cement. Turns out it's getting hard to get by cement. You see? So the point is that someone before that must have produced the cement. Someone must have produced, let's say, the bricks. You need some copper. Someone, you know, copper wiring. Well, someone, you know, these houses gotta get some lights. I mean, someone's gotta produce the lights. The point is that all of this production comes ultimately out of capital goods. Capital goods come kind of like, well, there's a second source actually, which I was getting or will be getting apparently in the next lecture, is that capital goods are coming out of investments and savings, or they're coming out of higher and better productivity. So you gotta get more capital goods, and it will be part investments and it will be part increased productivity. So by boosting consumption, you're actually working against the increase in capital goods. So you boost consumption, you know, everyone's consuming more, well, there is less savings and less investments. Actually, I'll be providing probably an example down the road in business cycles, but this is exactly what the problem of business cycle is. That government is typically trying to boost consumption of whatever and just hoping, oh, if we can boost consumption, we're going to provide the incentives. And the answer is yes, the incentives are there, but not the capital, but not the savings. All right, that's what we just don't have the bricks. Okay, so let's try a different way. Yeah, well, they are making phenomenal amount of profits, and they are trying to double the production of houses. But here's the problem: you can't just double the production of bricks, at least not in Bulgaria. The way to do it is, as it's done everywhere in the world. We have 7 factories of bricks in Bulgaria. If you really want to produce twice more bricks, you can't increase a lot more the output of these 7. They are already, making phenomenal profits and working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The way to do it is build 7 more factories for bricks. All right? All right. But building 7 more factories for bricks requires bricks, right? It requires cement. So you've got to cut down on the production of houses and whatever else consumption to release bricks and cement and everything else to produce 7 more factories. Oh, by the way, if you're going to be producing them, you'll need like 10,000 workers working on them. You'd better get them out of somewhere else. Again, we are hitting what's called the scarcity of resources. Yes, there is the profitability, but profits aren't enough. You need the capital. You need 10,000 workers, you need the bricks, you need the cement, you need everything else in order to get these 7 factories. But the problem is that increasing substantially the supply of bricks is not like flipping this switch over here. It doesn't work like that. It usually takes investments, it usually takes entrepreneurs, borrowing. It takes 3 to 5 years to get it going. All right? Then you gotta get the windows, you gotta get everything else. So you can't just make it more profitable and therefore increase the production structure. And that's the key. It usually takes 2 or 3 years for some pieces, 7 or 8 years for other pieces. And we're getting into the topic of business cycles because that's what essentially happens. Is this answering the question? I hope so. Any more questions? And let's see how much time. We got like 15 minutes, right? All right, well, 15 minutes. I'll get started with growth and see how well I can do in 15 minutes. I'll be providing more growth next time. So, we are done with capital structure. And what I have here is the cameraman will zoom into this little picture, which I'll be reconstructing for you guys on the board over the next 15 minutes with detailed explanations. This little picture represents what is called the Solow growth model. Now, there are at least a dozen of different theories of economic growth. And of course, you don't need the lecture as to why growth is so important. Again, those countries that grow a lot faster, within a couple of decades, they usually have much higher standards of living. In the end, I've been explaining to you, well, not explaining, just stating to you one of the most basic theories of economic growth. People save more. If they save more, the result, of course, is higher saving means higher investment. Higher investment means higher capital. Higher capital means higher output per worker, and this simply means higher standards of living. So let's see now how this whole thing works. I'm going to try to reconstruct this chart for you. So what do we have in here? Let's see how it looks. This is kind of like coming out of Bernanke, but it is very hard. Every time I read it, I'm getting confused. It's a little bit difficult, but I'll try to give you a kind of like a simplified, well, not too much simplified version. I'm just thinking that their explanation in the textbook is not so great. So number one, I am drawing here and here. The horizontal is called capital to labor ratio. So, capital to labor ratio is the value of capital divided by the quantity of workers, the number of workers. Well, capital labor ratio, that's how the textbook says it, is not as intuitive for a freshman as simply saying capital per worker. Capital, it is the same thing as capital per worker. So, is the worker having a brand new taxi or a 15-year-old taxi? Is he working with a $2,000 car or a $20,000 car? He's making transportation. Is he working with a little truck, you know, like a minivan? Or is he working with an 18-wheeler truck, which is, let's say, $100,000? Again, the higher the capital per worker, the higher the productivity. And here we have outputs. And this output is per worker. So, the textbook goes for all capital, for all workers, and then the textbook makes an intermediate step, and I'm beginning straight from the intermediate step. Everything we consider it per worker. So now I'm going to draw this black line over here, and the black line I'm going to reproduce as this. We call this little y, and little y simply represents output per worker. It is sloping like this simply because if you double capital per worker, output does not necessarily double. It increases but not quite as double. Again, this is related to the diminishing returns of productivity. You double the capital, productivity increases but not quite double. For example, someone's got 1,000 units of capital, he can produce 100 pieces. If he's got 2,000, he's not going to be capital, he's not going to be producing 200 pieces, he's going to be producing 190 or 180. Any questions on this chart over here? I think I drew it kind of like in our second lecture or third lecture, right? Did I? Alright, so this is fairly straightforward. Now, because it's a model, we make an assumption, and the assumption is fairly meaningful and realistic. The assumption is that of constant savings. For example, Bulgarians save roughly 5% of what we produce, the other 95% we consume. Chinese have fairly stable savings of around 40%. Again, for a fairly short period of time, 1, 2, 3 years, we assume constant savings. When I say constant savings, I must definitely mean constant savings ratio. This is the percentage of our output which we do not consume, but instead save for the future. Okay? And let's say the savings is something like 1/3 of it. So I'm going to draw the line probably, well, let's make it on the picture like 1/2. So I'm going to use a red line here. So if this is what we produce, saving is in the middle. Okay? If this is what we produce, saving is in the middle. So my new line will be exactly halfway from the above line, and it's going to go like this. So if this is y, this curve here will be s, which which is savings. Okay, let's try and just write it out. Savings, okay? So, I produce whatever, half of it is saved, the other one is consumed. So, effectively, this difference here is kind of like consumption, all right? And this difference here is savings. If we produced here, this is what we consume, and underneath is what we save. Is this curves, the second curve here? Clear. Did any questions on the chart so far? All right, so the next piece of the puzzle is that straight line going up there, and that straight line is called the depreciation line. So, here is the key. Depreciation is more or less assumed, and that's realistic, to be a portion, maybe 10% of the amount of capital. So, if you have a capital of, let's say, 5 units, your depreciation will be a percentage of it. Okay? Certain percentage of it, let's say 10%. If you get twice the capital of 10%, depreciation will be twice bigger. If you have 15, it's going to be 3 times bigger. If you have 20, it's going to be 4 times bigger. So, if you're having here the quantity of capital, depreciation must be, because it's assumed to be constant, must necessarily be a straight line. So, you got here your, and let's write it out, depreciation. Okay, so, is this fairly clear? You double the quantity of capital, you double the depreciation. Nothing magic. Is that fairly straightforward? And now we gotta see what is what on this picture. Well, let's make the picture dynamic. Suppose we begin at 5. Again, now what I will be working on is these green pieces over here. I'd better get my green pen. And we begin at 5. So, this is where our capital is today. Alright? And this is where our capital is today. So, this will be, let's call it T1. Alright? So, the economy today has capital of 5 per worker. We produce that much, right? This piece here has to be consumption, okay? And this big piece is investment, right? So, again, this is what is produced. This piece here represents, this section here represents the savings. Remember, this is a savings curve. So, this is how much the economy will save. And that's exactly how much it will invest. So, this whole piece is called gross investment. Gross investment. This piece here, let's kind of do it like this. This bottom portion is how much will depreciate from that capital. Okay? Is that fairly straightforward? Any questions so far? Well, what is going to be this piece over here, and this piece over here will be what we call net investment. So the net investment is investment which is above and beyond the depreciation. Alright? So this net investment results in an increase of capital capital per worker. Okay, so this is the key step, everybody. We'll need 5 minutes and I should be done within 5 minutes. Any questions so far? Is it fairly clear? Any questions? So, the key piece is this is what we consume. What we produce. Part of it goes just to recover the current existing depreciation. Part of it is consumption, which we gotta eat. And this difference here is the net investment, which results in the increase in capital. Well, if this is what we increase in capital, see how I'm now moving my hand there, right? Pay attention. This is how much the new capital will be. So now our new capital in T2 will be this piece. So this is how much new capital we'll have in the second year. So this is exactly how much we added as net investment, which adds on the capital above and beyond the regular depreciation. Now we're here, and again, this will be the new investment. Now, this piece here will move over here, so the new capital in T3 will be here, okay? Now, we're going to be getting a little less, you see? A little less. In other words, as we increase our overall capital, now more and more of our investments will be eaten by simply replacing old capital. In other words, compensating for depreciation. So now growth is a lot smaller, very small. This will be T4. And with T4, we're going to be getting, again, a tiny increase here. Now we're moving to T5. And with T5, you see, we're going to be getting a very small one. And as we're moving, let's put it this way, a big, big, big arrow. Let's try this with the green. Guys, pay attention. We're moving from T1 to T2. From T2, we are moving all the way to T3, to T4, to T5. Which, a different way of saying it is that we're going to be moving from here to here first. Then we're going to be moving up here. Then up here. Then here. Here, until we get to this point. Now, we will be approximating ever closer to this point and getting it in there at infinity, you know. So, this point here means that once we reach it, the economy does not change. Meaning, capital remains the same. Whatever we produce, we consume the same quantity. Whatever we save, we'll all invest and maintain the capital structure. So, output doesn't change, investment doesn't change, capital doesn't change. So, all variables do not change. So, they remain steady over time. And therefore, this point here has a name. It is called steady state. And the overall force is to move towards the steady state. But here is the key. You move towards the steady state if you begin from the left with too little capital. Well, what will happen if you begin with too much capital? The answer is, if you begin with too much capital, depreciation will be more than savings in investment, and therefore some capital value will be lost due to depreciation. So, if that's the case, you will move to the left, and then this is the depreciation. We're going to be moving from here again. This will be depreciation, loss of capital. We'll be moving again, and then again. Is this guys fairly clear? So here net investment is positive, capital increases. Here, because depreciation is larger than investment, we have a loss of capital, or net investment is negative, capital decreases. So eventually, no matter where you start, you're going to be dynamically over time ending towards the steady state. Now, with the steady state, this means that the economy will not have any growth unless there is pure productivity. So, what I showed here was growth. That was growth has two components. The first component is due to capital accumulation. And the second component is due to pure productivity. In other words, even though we have the same workers and even though they have the same capital, the same machine and everything, from one year to the next with the same resources, working in capital, we're going to be producing more. Simply because we learn how to produce, simply because we optimize our way that we produce, and simply because we are better able to forecast the future. Entrepreneurs will be making less mistakes and so forth. So, essentially what this theory is saying is that for countries with relatively little little capital per worker, growth will be driven mostly by capital accumulation. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, the capital accumulation is determined itself by the savings rate. The higher the savings rate, the higher the overall capital. So, according to this theory, called Solow growth model, economic growth depends on capital accumulation, which in turn depends on the savings rate. And it also depends on pure productivity, and therefore, according to the theory, it is extremely important to study in general pure productivity. So let's see for all questions, as we are, at least as I am done for today, as I had what I had to do. Any questions, guys, before we get done? Any questions? None? So next time I'm thinking on Friday of doing the Austrian theory of economic growth, which is also part of that textbook. It is not too different, but it is a lot more refined, a lot more sophisticated. So get a little bit more pieces because they are later important for understanding business cycles appropriately. Any questions? Anything? All right, let's start it off.